Kia ora, good morning everyone, Richard here, welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to have a look at a new lens that I believe will be really popular. It is this Fujifilm XF 16-50 f2.8 to f4.8 RLMWR. This is the standard zoom kit lens that Fujifilm released alongside with the X-T50, which we have also just reviewed on this channel as well. This lens is replacing the Fujifilm XF 18-55 as the new zoom kit lens for Fuji X-mount cameras. While these two lenses are very similar and they also look very similar from the outside, but there are many changes and improvements that Fujifilm has done to this new lens. So in this review, I'm going to show you all my test results of this new 16-50 lens. We'll also do some comparisons with the Fujifilm 18-55 and see what are the differences between these two lenses, and is the new lens actually any better or not. Okay, let's start this review by looking at the design of this Fujifilm 16-50 lens. Most of you guys watching this video should have some experience with the Fujifilm 18-55 lens, as that lens is a very popular kit lens and probably one of the most popular lens for the Fujifilm X-mount cameras. The size of this new kit lens is almost identical to the Fujifilm 18-55. The height is virtually the same, the diameter of the lens is also the same, it also has a 58mm front filter thread. Even the position of the focus ring, zoom ring, aperture ring, and the aperture control switch are all the same. So if you are someone who has been shooting with the 18-55 lens for a while, switching to this 16-50 lens, you will feel very familiar. But if you look a little bit closer, there are a few differences. The zoom ring on the 16-50 lens is now a rubber ring. There isn't any OIS switch on the lens body anymore because this lens doesn't have optical image stabilizer. The reason Fujifilm does not include OIS on this new lens is probably because with the just released X-T50, pretty much all the current X-mount camera body all have in-body image stabilizer or the IBIS. The only camera that doesn't have IBIS is the X Pro 3, which we can all imagine when Fujifilm updates that camera, the successor will also have IBIS. So it makes sense for Fujifilm to not include OIS, as it can make the lens lighter, cheaper to make, and probably it will give more flexibility to the optics designer as well. Another major difference is that this 16-50 lens is an internal zoom lens. It means when you zoom in or zoom out the lens, the overall length of the lens will remain the same. The 18-55 would extend quite a bit when you zoom in the lens. The lens extend or not when you zoom does not really mean too much to most users, but the fact that the 18-55 lens barrel would extend and contract, it means there is a slightly more chance that you can get a bit of dust inside the lens after using the lens for a while, especially the 18-55 is not a weather sealed lens. This new 16-50 lens is a weather sealed lens, and there are multiple weather seals including the one on the lens mount. The weight of this new lens is approximately 240 grams without the lens hood or the lens cap. It is around 25% lighter than the 18-55 lens, which is approximately 310 grams. I'm not too sure if it's because the 18-55 lens is heavier, but that lens does feel a little bit more solid compared to the 16-50 lens. Even though both lenses all have metal lens mount and the construction appears to be very similar. Comparing the 16-50 lens with the 18-55, the 16-50 focal length is 2mm wider on the wide end, but 5mm shorter on the tele end. If you have watched some of my previous reviews, you will know I always prefer a wider wide end for a standard zoom lens. I'm happy to sacrifice a bit of the teddy end, as I can always just crop a little bit if I need a slightly longer reach. So to me, I love this new lens focal length a lot more, and I find it more versatile, especially when I'm using it indoor or shooting landscape photos. Another difference is the maximum aperture. This new 16-55 is f2.8 to f4.8. The 18-55 lens is f2.8 to f4. I've plotted a graph of the maximum aperture at different focal length for both lenses. If you look at this graph, the 18-55 does have slightly faster maximum aperture across the whole focal length range. At around 50mm focal length, the 18-55 is half a stop faster, but as we move closer to the wide end, the difference is much smaller. One interesting thing I noticed is that when I have the lens set to the wide end and set to the maximum aperture, as I'm changing the focal length, the aperture display on the camera would go up in 0.1 steps for the 16-50mm lens for most of the range, but with the 18-55 lens, it will go up in much bigger steps. Each step is 0.4. It suggests the new lens has many hidden improvements that may not be very obvious to users. Autofocus is really quiet and smooth with this new 16-50mm lens. Even when using the lens indoor, I cannot really hear any autofocus noise no matter I'm shooting photos or shooting video. Autofocus speed is also reasonably fast, especially when you are shooting outdoor during the day. If you stop down the aperture and take a photo, I can hear a little bit of the aperture noise, but it is a lot more quiet if you compare it with the 18-55 lens. Okay, now let's have a look at the image sharpness. All these test photos were shot using my 40 megapixel X-H2. I'm also going to include some side-by-side comparisons with the 18-55 lens, so you can see how this lens performance is like when compared to the 18-55 lens. We'll first look at the wide end. So it's 16mm focal length for the 16-50 lens and 18mm focal length for the 18-55 lens. I have shifted the tripod position slightly when I switch to the 18-55 lens because of the difference in focal length. Okay, now let's zoom in and look at the center. At f2.8, the 16-50 lens is pretty sharp already, noticeably sharper than the 18-55 lens. Stopping down to f4, the 18-55 lens becomes a lot sharper, but it's still not as sharp as the 16-50 lens. At f5.6, the 16-50 lens is really sharp. Once we reach f11, then the image starts to soften up a bit due to diffraction. And let's have a look at the corner now. At f2.8, both lenses are slightly soft, but this time the 16-50 is a little bit softer. The corner sharpness would improve gradually as we stop down the lens. At f5.6, the 16-50 lens becomes quite sharp and pretty much the same as the 18-55 lens. And let's have a look at the teddy end now. The 16-50mm lens were shot at 50mm focal length. The photos from the 18-55 lens were shot at 55mm focal length. Once again, I moved the tripod position slightly to compensate the difference in the field of view. If you look at the center, even at the maximum aperture, the 16-50 lens is already very sharp. But this is the same for the 18-55 lens as well. Because of that, stopping down the lens doesn't actually improve the image sharpness. The sharpness remains the same until we reach f11. And now let's have a look at the corner. At maximum aperture, the 16-50 lens is also very sharp, but the 18-55 lens is soft, very soft. When I'm shooting test photos, I usually will shoot multiple photos with the same setting in case there's some random one-off error with one of my test photo. But when I went through the multiple photos I shot with the 18-55 lens, they are all pretty much the same. The center is sharp, but the corner is blurry. But the photos that I focus at the corner, then the corner is quite sharp, but now the center is blurry. So it seems the 18-55mm lens, at least my sample, has quite a bit of field curvature at the 55mm focal length. The 16-50mm lens doesn't have this issue at all. For the 16-50 lens, the corner sharpness is pretty much the same until diffraction kicks in at around f11. With the 18-55mm lens, when we stop down to f8, the corner now becomes much better. I do not know what is the official maximum magnification ratio of this new lens, but I checked how close I can focus at both the wide end and telephoto end. This is the photo I shot at 16mm focal length at the minimum focus distance. The distance between the front of the lens and the subject is approximately 95mm. This is much closer than what I can do with the 18-55mm lens. The minimum distance between the subject and that lens is pretty much double. By measuring the height of the SD card in the photo, I calculated the magnification ratio is around 0.14 times. The sharpness of the photo shot at f2.8 is okay. If we stop down the lens just a little bit to f4, then we can get much sharper photo. And now when I zoom in the lens to 50mm focal length, this is the photo that I shot at the minimum focus distance. The distance between the front of the lens and the subject is around 130mm. So that means the minimum focus distance is around 200mm. Again, this is much closer than the 18-55mm lens. I measured the maximum magnification ratio again and it is around 0.35 times, which is pretty good. The sharpness of the photo shot at the minimum focus distance at maximum aperture 4.8 is slightly soft, but I think it's still acceptable. Stopping down a bit to f5.6, now the photo is already very sharp. Comparing with the 18-55 lens, the 18-55's maximum magnification ratio is quite a bit lower, both at the wide end and the telephoto end. The photo shot with the 18-55 at the minimum focus distance also seems to be a little bit softer as well. So overall, the 16-50 lens is a much better choice if you like to shoot close-up photos. Let's talk about bokeh now. First of all, since the focal length of this lens is not very long and the maximum aperture is alright but it's not like super fast, so usually you won't dissolve the background too much when shooting with this lens. However, if you're shooting close-up photos, especially at the tele end, it is still possible to dissolve the background quite a bit. And the quality of the background blur I think is average. Quite often there is a bit of highlight at the edge of the bokeh balls. The bokeh balls are also not completely smooth. However, it does remain reasonably round even when I stop down the lens a bit. I also don't see any swirly cat's eye bokeh as well. And we'll look at vignetting next. Let's have a look at the JPEG file from the camera, which means this is with vignetting correction already applied. There is virtually no vignetting at all at both wide end and the telephoto end. Even the photos shot at the maximum aperture, there is pretty much no light fall off at all at the corner. If we look at the raw files, I bring them into Adobe Lightroom and turn off the lens correction. Now, At the wide end, there is a small amount of vignetting at the maximum aperture. Comparing it with the 18-55, there seems to be slightly less vignetting at f2.8. Stopping down to f4 and vignetting almost all disappeared. At the teddy end, without any correction, the 16-50 lens only has a very tiny amount of vignetting at maximum aperture. Interesting thing is, the 18-55 lens has quite a bit more vignetting at maximum aperture, and even when both lenses are stopped down to f5.6, the 18-55 lens still has a bit more vignetting. Although, to be honest, the amount is so small that it doesn't really matter when you are taking real-world photos. Okay, let's have a look at distortion now. Again, we will start with the JPEG from the camera, which means there is already correction applied. The 16-50mm lens has very minimal amount of barrel distortion at the wide end, is really minimal. The 18-55 lens has more noticeable barrel distortion at the wide end. At the teddy end, both lenses have virtually no noticeable distortion. And we have a look at the raw file now with the profile correction disabled. The 16-50 lens has quite a bit of barrel distortion at the wide end, a little bit more than the 18-55mm lens. At the teddy end, both lenses have a bit of pincushion distortion, but this time it is the 18-55 lens that has slightly more distortion. In terms of chromatic aberration, the 16-50mm lens is quite well controlled in this area. I see minimal amount of color fringing around the high contrast area. If we look at these local test photos which were shot in RAW format and I have all the correction disabled, I see the photo shot with the 16-50 lens has a little bit less color fringing than the photo shot with the 18-55mm lens. Lens flare performance of this new 16-50mm lens is good. While I see a bit of ghosting sometimes, overall I don't really notice too much lens flare issue when shooting with this lens. When I do some side-by-side comparison with the 18-55, I notice the 16-50 has better contrast, especially around the area close to the bright light source. Okay, it's time to look at Sunstars. I shot the following test photos at 35mm focal length with the 16-50mm lens, stopping down slightly to f5.6, and we can already get some pretty sharp and nice looking Sunstars. Actually, for this set of test photos, I feel the Sunstars at f5.6 looks even better than when I stop down all the way to f16 or f22. Comparing it with the 18-55mm lens, the Sunstars from the 18-55mm lens looks a lot worse in my opinion. You need to stop down that lens a lot to see Sunstars, and even when you do that, the tails of the Sunstars still look quite messy. I definitely prefer the Sunstars from this new 16-50mm lens. We'll look at my focus briefing test results next. As usual, I changed the focus between 1 meter and 20 meter to see how much focus briefing is there. At the wide end, there's only a tiny amount of focus briefing. It's not very noticeable. At the teddy end 50mm, the focus briefing becomes a lot more noticeable. I won't say it's terrible, but interestingly, if you compare it with the 18-55mm lens, there is more focus briefing with this new lens. The Fujifilm XF 18-55 is one of the most popular lenses from Fujifilm. A lot of people even call it the best kit lens in the market. So when I received the sample of this new kit lens, I really wonder, can Fujifilm really improve much? But after doing all these tests and shooting with this lens over the last few weeks side by side with the 18-55mm lens, I'm glad to report this new 16-50 lens is indeed a better lens. The overall image quality is better. You get better looking Sunstars, for example, and less lens flare. Even though in some areas the difference is very minor because the 18-55 lens was already very nice. But there are also some downsides with this new lens. One is that it no longer has optical image stabilizer. So for people with the older camera that doesn't have IBIS, they may be better just stick with the old 18-55mm lens. And the other downside is that the old lens seems to have better focus breathing control, which I was a bit surprised as I thought the new lens would be better given that Fujifilm put a much stronger focus on video shooting recently. Of course, focus breathing doesn't really affect you if you mostly just take photos. The new lens also has a few other improvements. Being weather resistance is definitely very important for a lot of people. For people who may regularly shoot under bad weather conditions, this alone could be a reason for you to get this new lens. This lens is also a lot lighter, and I also like the much better close focus shooting distance, which makes this lens really suitable for taking some nice close-up photos like flowers or some small objects. Being an internal zoom lens is also good for people that take a lot of close-up photos. There really isn't too many things that I can complain about this new lens. Maybe the only thing that I personally want is if it can go even wider to 13 or 14mm focal length, as I really enjoy the wide-end 20mm focal length on my full-frame Sony and Lumix cameras with their zoom lens, but this 16-50 lens is already wider than the 18-55 lens, so I'm not really complaining. If you already have one of the newer Fujifilm body that has IBIS, or you're planning to pick up a new body like the new X-T50, which I've also just reviewed, I would highly recommend you to consider this lens, even if you're usually a prime shooter like me. It is just a really good and versatile kit lens.